Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our final webinar of the Adaptation Design Tool Mentored Online course. You've made it through the whole course at this point, so congratulations. And just again, my name is Sherry Wagner, and I'm the Reefers Lands Program Coordinator with the Nature Conservancy and the coordinator for this training. And I'd also like to welcome on today's webinar our mentors, Jordan West, Britt Parker, David Gibbs, and we have a special guest today, Kim McGuire from the American Samoa Department of Marine and Wildlife Resources. So thank you, mentors, also for joining us today. And we're recording the webinar so it can be reviewed later on or for folks that could not join us today. So just to remind you, there's two ways you can ask questions or participate in our discussion today. One is you can type your question into the question box at any time, or you can raise your hand by clicking on the small hand icon on the toolbar, and I will call on you and unmute you, and then you can ask your question or tell us your comment. And if you have any difficulties, if you can't see the slides or hear, send me a message in the question box and I'll try to work with you to resolve it. So if you have been on the other webinars, you've seen this course schedule. I just wanted to show it one more time. So you've swam all the way through the course. The last thing that you would have worked on is here, the lesson 4 and assignment. So over the past 10 days or so, I think, you've had time to work through the lesson, which demonstrates application of the tool to identify gaps in your existing management plan and brainstorm new actions to fill those gaps. And then it concluded, that lesson concluded with next steps on how the tool results can be used to inform other steps of the climate smart conservation cycle. So we're now down here on the final webinar. And today on the webinar, we'll go into more depth on this final assignment, which asks you to fill in the matrix worksheet for the example actions provided for Guanaco Bay, Puerto Rico, to see how well they cover different strategies, and then use the compendium to add actions to worksheet 2. So that's what we're going to work on today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jordan West, and she'll go into more more detail on activity 2, and then introduce our featured guest for today. So here comes the screen sharing over to you, Jordan.
How does it look?
Yep, looks good.
Looks good. Yep.
Excellent. So yes, this is Jordan West with EPA's Office of Research and Development. I want to welcome those of you who are able to be on the call live today. Thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you listening to this later, welcome to you as well. This is the final webinar. We're going to cover both activity 2, or which corresponds with lesson 4 of the online course, and we'll talk about wrapping it all up, how it all ties back together in the course conclusion. So recall that for activity 2, that lesson 4 module, you learned that activity 2 helps you identify additional actions to address climate-related vulnerabilities that may not yet be sufficiently addressed in an existing plan. Or in the case of someone who might not have a plan and might be starting from scratch, you could start here to start brainstorming and building a list of potential adaptation actions. We took the case of providing Guanaco Bay, Puerto Rico. As you know, you had a vulnerability assessment from there, and we focused on this as a case study for activity 1. Likewise, for this activity, we asked you to fill in the blank rows of a matrix worksheet to help you do a bit of a gap analysis to see how well a handful of actions that are real actions that were developed by our partners in Guanaco Bay, to see how well they cover the 7 strategies covered by the compendium. So here is the matrix, and we provided some filled examples, give an idea of how to do it, and here are our suggestions for the remaining actions. A couple of points I want to make is notice that actions can cover more than one strategy. There's not a one-to-one relationship between actions and strategies. And the second point is that your interpretation of which strategies are covered by an action might be a little bit different, and that can be okay. So in the example of the eliminate invasive lionfish, when you study the compendium, you find reference to dealing with invasive species under a reduce non-climate stresses. But if you're in the restoring structure and function section and you're concerned with key species of the system that might be, for instance, being driven out by an invasive species, you could come up with a suggestion of dealing with an invasive species while thinking of that strategy. Likewise, for mangroves, we can think about the importance of connectivity between mangroves that are adjacent to coral reefs because, for instance, certain fish species spend part of their life cycle in each system and there needs to be connectivity. And you can consider mangroves a key ecosystem feature that is essential, being an adjacent habitat to the success of coral reefs. So depending on how you're thinking about these actions, you might have put the X's in a slightly different pattern. But the main point here is it's useful to just think from the perspective of every strategy and come up with actions that represent a good variety of coverage of the things that you find in the literature. That's the goal. So the next part of the assignment was to now come up with some new ideas yourself. You had the vulnerability assessment, so you could think about vulnerabilities, and you had the compendium, so you could think about general ideas. And the requirement in worksheet 2 is to identify what is the threat that's maybe not sufficiently covered or could be covered better, and what is a specific version of a general action in the compendium. In other words, the compendium contains some pretty general ideas from the literature that are just tossed out as strategies for adaptation, often not, never place specific because in a lit review, they're just suggestions. So in order to really have actions benefit from being put through the tool, they need to be specific actions, specifically described, and they need to be identified as much as possible with the species or the location or other aspects that are specific to your place. So what we're going to do now is turn it over to Kim McGuire, who's our featured participant guest. Kim's with American Samoa's Department of Marine and Wildlife Resources. She's their climate change coordinator based in American Samoa, and we asked Kim to give activity 2 a try, thinking from the perspective of American Samoa. And so Kim's going to present what she did with the rest of activity 2. So Kim.
All right, thank you so much, Jordan. I found the compendium to be very helpful when doing this activity. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about the examples that I've put into this. So we have here in front of us the Guanaco Bay watershed examples, and it was good for me to look over these and see how they related to American Samoa as well, with our coastal habitats and our own reefs here. So let's see. We can just discuss over Guanica Bay's examples here, and then let's jump into American Samoa. So one of our priority watersheds in American Samoa is Fanga'alu Bay, and it's a highly populated area. There's also a hospital in the area, and also a very big rock quarry. So it's the Fanga'alu rock quarry, and there was a lot of sediment coming from this quarry for a while, and it was a major priority for us to make sure that we reduce this non-climate stress from the quarry. So you can see here that I plugged that in, and a major action that we took was creating settling ponds to minimize the loadings of sediment and nutrients. And that's proven to be very effective. All the excessive sediment has kind of been settled in these ponds. Another thing that I looked into was protecting the key ecosystem features. And a species that I really focus on is parrotfish. Herbivorous fish like parrotfish are key for the livelihood of the Reef and American Samoa population. So focused on that and how we can prevent overfishing. And let's see. It's important that we keep those around because of the issues with algae. And let's see. Another one that I addressed is restoring structure and function. Let's see. We use ox bile injections to control crown of thorns starfish. And what was really helpful about this whole exercise was the thought process that kind of gets combed through with using these activity sheets, these worksheets. We were talking about how the crown of thorns outbreak started in American Samoa. We had a huge tsunami in 2009, which brought a lot of nutrients into the water and allowed the crown of thorns to just thrive because of all the nutrients. And since then, we've taken an active stance in trying to control them. And what we do is we use ox bile injections to control these outbreaks. We basically find the individual crown of thorns, and then we inject them with ox bile. And another one is we're looking into protecting the refugia by creating large managed areas. This way, we can provide a place for the fish to repopulate without the stresses of heat and other things brought on by climate change. Another one is we're looking into establishing coral nurseries for outplanting of acropora. This goes under the relocating of organisms. And yeah, that's basically what I saw would be useful for Fanga'alu Bay. And it was really helpful to use the compendium just to refer to. And this was a good exercise.
Kim, can I ask you a quick question?
Any questions?
Jordan.
Sure.
You said that you're looking into establishing coral nurseries. So is this something that isn't set up yet? Is this something that basically is going to require whole new infrastructure and approvals and something that's not currently something you're doing, or is this something you've already got going?
We have a coral nursery in another village on the other side of the island, in the village called Leone, and it's still in the experimental phase. It hasn't necessarily produced a lot of coral to be outplanted, but we see that it could be very useful and effective if we can get it going properly, so that we can use it in multiple villages, including Fanga'alu.
Great.
Yeah, so these are all great possibilities that we're looking into, and it's great to use these worksheets to kind of bring it out. So yeah, I liked using this. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, for participants on the call, just remember, you can raise your hand if to ask him a question or Jordan, or type it to me in the question box and I can ask for you. So you can take a minute. Are there any questions right now, or we can also have time later too for questions? Yeah, I'm not seeing anything right now, Kim, if you want to
Okay, no
continue on.
problem. Okay, so then we went back to the matrix worksheet and we added new actions to see how our strategy coverage is improving. Can go on to the next slide. So we still see some examples here from Guanica Bay up on top. And American Samoa has our highlighted actions here at the bottom in blue. And there you can see the columns that they were effective. I was pretty pleased when I saw this to see that a lot of the actions stretched across the board, and I wouldn't have really thought that it would have accomplished all these different actions unless I saw it laid out like this. So this is great. So some columns had more than others, but it looks like it was a really good stretch of all the different categories.
So Kim, when you did the exercise, did you like work your way straight through the compendium? Did you sort of read straight through, or did you already have some ideas and kind of skipped around, you know, looking for things that you were familiar with first, or did you just sort of read it cover to cover and pick out these actions that corresponded well with things that would work for American Samoa?
Well, I read through the compendium and I made note of what stood out to me and what I could relate to American Samoa. So I made sure just to look through everything, and then as I made note of things that looked like they related to American Samoa, I went back to them and then went into detail about how I could plug that in for American Samoa.
Great.
So it was helpful to go through it all and then go back. Hey, David.
Hey, what question for you also?
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering which of the strategies were the most difficult to come up for actions, or come up with actions for. If there were any that stood out as being harder to come up, you know, with anything.
Well, I like the idea of designating the large managed areas, but that was still something new to me, so it was a challenge to visualize, but at the same time, I'm glad that I was able to plug it into the connectivity portion, because it was still something that was, it was new. It was new to me. But it's, yeah, it proved to be helpful.
Yeah, that looks like it's that one has especially good coverage. Nice to see.
Yeah, you could almost make the managed areas, you know, I suppose supporting evolutionary potential could even be covered if you are particularly targeting areas with, say, a high biodiversity, or the fact that you're targeting, or if you targeted areas that are not only natural refugia, but highly biodiverse, yeah, then you could consider it as supporting diversity that would allow evolutionary potential. So the way that you use MPAs or managed areas would determine how many X's go in your strategies.
Right.
Strategies. Very cool. Okay.
All right. Well, how about our participants? Were you able to come up with any actions for activity 2? And did you find the compendium helpful in coming up with your own ideas? How about the vulnerability assessment?
And for those on the phone, feel free to just type in an example of an action that you came up with. Or the other thing we'd really like to know is how many actions were you able to come up with when you spent, a reasonable amount of time, what you felt was a reasonable amount of time on the exercise. Or comments on, like Kim just said, the compendium or the vulnerability assessment, and that process of trying to crosswalk between those two resources and come up with ideas. So if folks have any verbal or written comments, we'd love to hear them.
Or if you weren't able to come up with anything, we'd love to know why not. What would have made it easier to come up with some actions if you're having trouble with it?
Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands up or anything in the question box right now.
It's okay. It can take a minute to, I know it can take a minute to think of something to type or to say. So we're going to pause again in just a few minutes. So hold these questions in your head and can comment on any of these things in another minute or two, because we just want to now kind of follow through with the remainder. So Kim?
Yes. All right, so I'll go ahead and move forward with going back to worksheet 1A and adding new actions. Let's see. So once you add in these new ones, there you go. So I just plugged these in to worksheet 1A, and then I plugged them into worksheet 1B. And you can see how it was revisited. Any questions about this one?
So Kim, when we didn't require that, obviously, that the actions be completely run through, although that's what you would ultimately want to do. So what are some of the ways that you can imagine either the ox-bile injections or the settling ponds would be affected either through the effects on their stressors or directly by climate change? These two seem to be ones that are pretty specific and you know quite a lot about since you've been using settling ponds. So do you have any thoughts about how climate change might affect, say, the effectiveness of the settling ponds in this particular location?
Right. Good question. American Samoa receives a lot of rain. So with climate change, we're expecting an increase in storms and extreme weather. So there's going to be a lot more water coming through and carrying sediment through the quarries. So a main concern is, will these settling ponds be able to withstand all this stress? And that's something that we definitely have to look into in the years to come, whether we're going to have to create more settling ponds or how are we going to need to adjust this action to make it more climate resilient, especially with we have so much rain here already, and with the anticipation of increased storms, something we have to manage and prepare for.
So up to now, when you have extreme rain events, particularly extreme ones, so far is the problem more that the settling ponds might not be able to accommodate all the sediment loads, or do you think are they sometimes actually being washed out and damaged badly, or is it a combination of both? And which do you think is where things are headed?
I foresee that both of those problems could surface with extreme weather, extreme rain events, and you know what they say, you have to just prepare for the worst. But
Right.
I would think that we just have to find ways to create more ponds or just expand upon the ones we have now.
Right. And I think you said that the rock quarry owners were really on board with these settling ponds, and so you probably do have the flexibility to make those kinds of changes.
Right. There's like been 2 actions taken with the quarry. They stopped washing the crushed rocks with water and cover the working roads with gravel just to stop the fine grain from washing into the stream, and building the retention ponds, the settling ponds between the quarry and the stream, because there's that main stream that runs right by the quarry straight into the ocean. It's a stream that often overflows with the heavy rain. It's a stream that's so strong it's even caused a loss of life here because it's a very, very fast-moving stream with all the rain. So the quarry has definitely taken matters into their own hands, and they've been very cooperative with these actions.
Cool. So I'm just imagining in my head where I would be writing all these things down in these different columns, and hopefully folks on the phone can get an idea of where this one might be headed. Do any other mentors have any thoughts or questions? Or participants?
David, if there are any participants, I can wait, but anyway, sorry, so is there anything from participants?
Someone just made a comment from the last question that we asked about the compendium. They said it was very helpful, although they only worked on hypothetical examples.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I was going to say that I was having fun thinking about the crown of thorns example for this, thinking about how primarily changes in nutrients would affect crown of thorns outbreaks, and maybe changes in ocean circulation due to,
Right.
I guess, probably changes in water temperature.
Right.
And so how that would change the frequency of outbreaks and their duration, and maybe where they're occurring, or the seasons of those, and then so how that would affect how frequently you can go out and kill a crown of thorns, how often you would need to, over what area you might need to. There's a lot of fun possibilities there.
Definitely.
And that's not something that we've thought about in the Caribbean, obviously, fortunately. There being no crown of thorns in the Caribbean yet. So that's a very new one for me.
Right on.
Yeah.
Kim, who are the people that go out and do these injections? Like, what kind of capacity? If you had, much bigger outbreaks, what would that mean for trying to get people out there if they're injecting one at a time?
That's just it. It's the manpower. It's a very tedious job to go out and find them and inject them. And our staff here in the Coral Reef Advisory Group have taken an active role in going out there, but also the national parks of American Samoa have been very, very crucial in controlling the crown of thorns, especially in the park area on the north shore of the island. So there are people who are trained to do this, but I could imagine that if the outbreaks continue and if they increase, a great challenge we have here is capacity to go out and eradicate them. There's still methods that we encourage, or we know that people use within the villages without the ox bile. Like, some people will literally get a long stick and get the crown of thorns and put it out on the beach just to let them dry out, because not everyone's equipped with injections in ox bile. So people have taken matters into their own hands in some villages and have done that, where they just make sure not to touch the crown of thorns. And you know, using what we have in American Samoa, we can be very resourceful, and using a large, long stick has proven to be effective in some villages in removing the crown of thorns from the reef and putting them on the beach to dry out.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because when I think about, you know, this one, and if you were to fill out all these columns, I could really see it going both ways, in the sense of how much bigger and more widespread might these outbreaks be. You know, maybe we're not positive, but if we think that we're pretty much on the edge of our capacity already, you know, there could be some serious concern here about whether this method could really take care of the problem.
Right.
On the other hand, if the crown of thorns are so destructive that it needs to be a priority, then that might argue for really a big investment in this method, or at least continuing this method in combination with the, you know, with the other kind of cruder methods, you know, getting more and more village participant and, you know, volunteer participation. And maybe you could either scale back on the oxybio injections, or you might still decide that you need them in combination with everything else if it's that important, you know, of a problem. So it seems like this information either way would kind of help you start to assess
what else we need to do, right? We've been researching other ways, because we always have to take the environment into consideration. We have to make sure whatever we're using is not going to damage the reef even further. So people have been looking into other ways and other natural substances that could be effective in killing the crown of thorns. So this is definitely something that would help us revisit those ideas and strategize how we could prepare for a bigger outbreak.
Very interesting. So I'm just flipping to this slide because just again to give people an opportunity, we have some even more general questions here, or people can reflect on previous questions. So maybe I can ask you, Kim, to reflect on the overall experience, reflect on these questions, but I also wanted to ask you about a question we often get for people is how much time these things take. So for the level of, you know, the number of iterations you did, or, you know, what was the time commitment for you to kind of begin to build this list and get an idea of how it works and do some refining? And how did that work for you, and how was the experience for you?
All right. Well, I definitely wanted to be as thorough as I could in looking over the compendium and finding the things that were relevant to American Samoa. So I would say I took about 2.5 hours, to be honest. I read over it and then read over it again and then made note of what was relevant. And then I went back and plugged it in. But I would say that looking over the compendium a couple of times and really getting a grasp of it helped me to move through the worksheets more effectively. So most of the time was spent looking over the compendium and then really asking myself, how does this relate to American Samoa? And then once I focused and found those points, then it was smooth sailing from there. But it was just a matter of taking the time to get a grasp of the compendium, and then it was a lot smoother once I had a better understanding of it. So yeah, I would say 2.5 hours.
So, and it wasn't too difficult to not only recognize those general ideas, but then kind of turn them into the specific version for your place.
Yeah, I would say once I got the general idea, then making the specific examples came a lot easier. So getting that understanding of the general idea makes it a lot smoother. So Yeah, I
Yeah,
think it was an overall good exercise because it made me think about other strategies and actions that American Samoa really needs to consider.
fantastic. Thank you so much for being our star
Oh no,
featured
thank you.
people for today.
You're
Really
the-
appreciate it. Other
I
folks,
appreciate it.
thanks. Anybody else on the line who wants to type or speak?
Doesn't look like right now, Jordan. Not seeing anything.
Okay. This is a good time for me to remember to mention that as asked about on the forum, and as I mentioned on the forum recently, we will provide these examples in Word document form, both the examples used on the last webinar by Chris Berg and the ones on this webinar by Kim McGuire. We'll post those on the course page within the next few days after the course is completed. Of course, everybody has access to looking at them in the meantime through the recorded webinar recordings. So that's another way to get to them if folks need them sooner, but we are going to post them on the course webpage later so that people can go back to them and can continue comparing what they did and refining what they did and just continuing to puzzle through it. I would say also that I think I can speak for David as well as myself that we're willing to monitor the forum for a while longer as well. So if folks are only now kind of finishing up this work and find that right after they hang up and have digested it, they start having questions and would really like to follow through, circle back on a couple things, we would be happy to continue answering forum questions for at least a couple more weeks.
Yes, we would love to hear from you at any point.
So Sherry, are we good to move on?
Yes, I'm not seeing any other comments or questions right now. Thanks.
Okay. So we're just going to take a few minutes to kind of circle back to the big picture. So here is the full flow of the tool. Congratulations, you have now explored every aspect of this, almost. You have done an activity 1 exercise. You've taken existing management actions that when you were given by example, or some people might have taken their own. You've used vulnerability assessment information along with looking at those actions to try out the design considerations in worksheets 1A and 1B and what that means for expressing a more detailed so-called climate smart version of the original action. And then most recently, you've used worksheet 2 along with both the vulnerability assessment and the compendium to see if you could brainstorm new actions that, again, you can see here, you would then iterate back to activity 1. So worksheet 2 helps you specify actions that are appropriate to fill gaps in your vulnerability coverage and that you would then want to see benefit from being run through these design considerations. The one piece that we have not had time to focus on in this course are these 2 white bubbles, which are the supplementary output 1 and supplementary output 2. So I wanted to just take a minute or two to just give you an idea of what that's about. So as you know, all 3 of the worksheets that you've used have a notes column where you were encouraged to write down information, ideas, considerations, anything that came up. And those things fall into kind of, we have found when working with experts, 2 basic categories, one being data and information gaps and research needs, and the second one being when you start realizing that using an action might require that action has a relationship to other actions, and that it's not being used in a vacuum, and that there might be interactions with other actions. So I just want to show you a quick example. This is straight out of the user guide, so you can always go back to this in the appendix of the user guide. So I think the information gaps and research needs is pretty intuitive. And you can just take this table as an example. You could add some different column headings or some additional column headings. But this is a place where you could sort of pluck all the information that is scattered across worksheet 1A, 1B, and worksheet 2 even, that has to do with questions that you have about information that's missing. It might be information that is possible to go get, and some of it might be information that does not yet exist and would need to be kind of sent along the research track. But these are just some examples. If we look at this Guanica Bay example of switching from sun-grown to shade-grown coffee, because shade-grown coffee can tolerate shade, it's possible to grow it interspersed with understory plants as well as upperstory canopy plants, which then keep the soil much better stabilized. And so that makes problems with erosion and sediment runoff in particular less of a problem. So with our Guanica Bay partners, here are just some examples of some questions that they wanted to make sure that they recorded for this action. Things having to do with understanding watershed processes better, both historical and current, and also moving into the future. What is it that we know about the drought tolerance, for instance, of shade-grown coffee plants, but also I would say the shade plants that you're going to be using to grow them under. How are climate drivers, column 4, relevant here? What do we know about projected increases in wind speeds? That can be really important for desiccation as well as physical stress. What will be changes in circulation patterns? Since this is all a problem for reefs, what do we know about sediment delivery to reefs, and what is even our target of how much sediment needs to be reduced, and how do we think about whether this strategy by itself or with others would be sufficient from a coral reef perspective? Moving on, column 5, climate change effects on the stressors of concern. In Guanica Bay, they wanted to do a geospatial analysis to look at where flooding in the valley could be documented. That might be important for targeting where you want to focus on this first to try to implement it. And then understanding the stressor effects on the biota in question. We need to understand sensitivity of reef species, and we also need to understand the sensitivity of the shade-grown coffee and the forests and the canopy plants and the understory plants. If those plants are not going to be surviving well, then this strategy, this action might change in its functionality in the future as we have more extreme events and droughts and stressors. So one question was, what is even known about the effects of stressors on these plants? And then what does all this mean for climate change effects on the effectiveness of the action? Well, we don't even know, how big an area we need to have stabilized to cut down on the sediment loads, for instance. So one of the things that I'm kind of thinking about, that if anybody has any reflections on, is it necessary to fill this kind of thing out action by action, or is it possible to just summarize a bunch of questions across all the actions that you've considered? In the one case, it would be good to not have a lot of repetitiveness, where some actions you might have the same questions in these columns, but at the same time, if you're focusing on a particular action, you might want to focus just on the research questions for that action. So it's one of the things I'm kind of debating, and maybe it might be useful for us to provide an example where we've just refined down to a key set of research questions, for instance, that are needed for the Guanica Bay watershed, that are common questions that apply to many actions. For supplementary output 2, now this is the one that has to do with analyzing, sequencing, and interaction. So here's what this worksheet looks like. What can come up in discussion as people are working through an action is, since no action is occurring in a vacuum, it is occurring in the context of other activities, often it'll start to pop up that there are some considerations that are important. So here again is the switching to sun-grown shade, sun-grown to shade-grown coffee example. So the climate smart version is planting shade-tolerant coffee and heat-tolerant shade plants, and using understory and secondary canopy plants that will effectively use or provide nutrients and will stabilize soil during intense storms. So since when we select the final priority actions for a plan, we're selecting a combination of things that we hope will be effective. Interdependencies among certain activities can be really important. Our Guanica partners emphasize that they would need to do a farm inventory in order to identify where the best place would be to implement this action, especially at first. The redundancy question is, of course, if you are using shade-grown coffee that can tolerate a shady, stabilizing canopy, that is mutually exclusive to growing non-shade tolerant coffee, the regular coffee, and using cover crops. So another technique is to, in between coffee crops, plant cover crops to stabilize the soil. So those things are mutually exclusive actions, and if one were to run cover crops, which folks are doing through the tool, then it might be possible to compare the relative effectiveness of these two actions relative to each other. And that might have some effects on which are chosen in particular locations for particular reasons. And then they felt that there was a synergetic relationship, a positive synergy with treatments and standards for dirt roads that run along these coffee farms, that if you were to implement the shade-grown coffee in combination with smart road treatments and standards, that those two things together could together have a greater effect than either one by itself, or at least would be additive with each other, so that together they might accomplish the total amount of sediment reduction necessary, where neither one by itself would be enough. They felt, in terms of column 5 sequencing, that it's possible to go ahead and be implementing shade-grown coffee, but that simultaneously they wanted to get on top of this farm inventory to assist in prioritization of where to do the next conversions, and to also simultaneously be working on the dirt road standard. So it seemed like all three of those activities needed to be done urgently and in parallel, as opposed to some kind of linear sequence. So that's the example, and the notes just sort of puts into narrative some of these questions that are in here, and does bring up other questions about best management practices, and how maybe this use of this action, does that require that we look at some different best management practices, including for things like fertilizers and pesticides and herbicide applications. So there we are. Those are the purposes of these optional supplementary output worksheets. So why are those helpful? So here we are. We're back at our overall climate smart cycle that you saw at the beginning of the course. We have been focusing on this step 4, which is identifying / brainstorming adaptation options. They can't really be considered true adaptation and actions until they've been subjected to the climate smart design consideration. So that's why this tool was sort of developed with that step in mind originally. Now, the purpose was to generate a large list of climate smart ideas so that as we move into step 5, you can evaluate and select your final group of priority actions, hopefully in a better informed, more rigorous, climate smart way. So especially that supplementary output 2, where you're beginning to think about how actions interact with each other, that can help as you move between a big list of actions and trying to come to grips with how you're going to evaluate and select a smaller set. One of the next steps of this project that we're considering is examining and examining how folks are currently going about this evaluation and selection process. What are the methods, either formal or informal, that people are using to take a potentially large list of ideas and decide what they're actually going to prioritize first? Can we demonstrate how the outputs from this tool and from these supplementary output worksheets can help inform that process? So that's one of the things that is the purpose of the tool, is to help inform that, and that we hope to look at next. But one of the things we realized with working with people in different settings using the tool is that the tool actually informs pretty much every other step of the cycle, not just step 5. For instance, we have mentioned in the course lessons that once folks have selected priority actions, they are interested in going back to the tool and further refining into greater and greater detail the answers to those questions in the columns. So David Gibbs, who is an ORISE fellow with us, has been doing a project with subject matter experts in Puerto Rico to take a couple of selected actions, bring in experts on those specific actions, and do what we call a deep cut on these actions, with the goal being to develop more detailed information that could then flow into an implementation plan. So there's another thing that David's working on that we're really interested in, is how far can you take the tool into detail, and then what does it look like to take that information and reorganize it into the standard form of, well, what are the decisions that need to be made and the steps for implementing the action in the climate smart way. The information in the tool also relates to step 7. You might recall that in worksheet 1A, there's a column that asks that question about what are your management targets, what are the metrics that you're going to use to measure effectiveness, and how might climate change affect the way you measure them. Well, identifying what are going to be your indicators or metrics that you're going to use to measure success will directly, hopefully, inform or prepare you for step 7. Because the goal is, after implementation, to then be tracking and evaluating the success so that one can continue to make improvements through time. Now, it works the other way as well. We can use the information on supplementary output 1, which is the information gaps and research needs, that often contains a lot of questions about climate impacts and vulnerabilities and unknowns that the person using the tool needs to know more about to really get firm and solid with some of the design considerations. Sometimes that means going back and finding existing vulnerability information that just hasn't been located or hasn't been put into the right form. But it also can mean that you've identified a real research need that the research community needs to know about. And I really feel like very strongly that we need to be giving that feedback back to those who are generating climate vulnerability and resilience information, give them the feedback of what information and what form of information is still needed. And sometimes when the design of an action might require that you move into another jurisdiction, that you, like if you're thinking of large marine protected areas or connectivity of areas, it might take you outside of your range of current jurisdiction of your plan. Or looking at the climate smart design of an action might make you realize that it may not even be possible to meet the objective, the original objective of that action. And in that case, that might send you back to step 3 to really review and revise, if necessary, goals and objectives of your plan. So that's the big picture. And we hope that the value added in using the tool beyond that thought process that we've been working on with these exercises is that when you're all finished, you have a set of information that was arrived at in a structured, systematic way, and a way that helps further clarify something that's a very complicated thought process. And it does that in a transparent way. It records it so that anybody coming or going from the program or anybody coming in can see the thought process by which a program or a decision has arrived at its current status. And this can really help lend credibility to decisions because there's a logical and defensible thought process behind it that can be shown. The tool helps look at uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. So there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainty, and the tool explicitly asks for you to make a note of what the uncertainties are and their degree, but encourages just marching through that thought process and being prepared with the understanding that as information improves and as the knowledge base improves, we may be able to reduce some of the uncertainties and go back and improve the information. So again, having that recorded in a way that allows you to continually go back and improve is really useful to people. It supports consideration of spatial and temporal scales. There are questions that explicitly ask about temporal sequencing and bring up some of these issues of relationships among actions and, of course, the scale at which climate change is occurring versus the scale at which you need to do action. And we are also finding that it provides a practical basis for folks who then want to go back to thinking about their higher level strategic planning. Because after all, a strategic plan, its goals and objectives are met through specific activities. And so to the degree that you can assess the ability of your specific activities to be climate smart, that's going to give you feedback on whether you can meet your own strategy or whether certain parts of your strategy need to go away or new parts need to be brought in, or whether just a reprioritization of what aspects of the strategy are strongest. So that brings us to the end of the course, and I want to again pause and give folks time to think about any of their reflections of the previous questions or any of their reflections of how it's been to take the course, maybe just how might you envision this being useful in your own work. And one of the ideas we have, and I'm interested to know if people would be enthusiastic about it, is would you be willing to share your results when you try out these worksheets? Just like we have now collected from Chris Berg and Kim McGuire some examples, and we have examples from previous consults and collaborations. We'd really like to build a repository of examples because, as Kim noted, when you have starting examples to get yourself kind of oriented to how it all works, it begins to be a lot easier to match up for your place what are similar or different examples or actions that you want to look at. So do either our mentors or our participants or Kim have any thoughts or questions?
Jordan, there's a comment from a participant that the exercise was straightforward and they spent about an hour looking at the compendium examples and about 20 minutes plugging in potential new activities into worksheet 1. And they're interested in applying the tool to their work and hope they can get input and advice from the team in the future.
Fantastic. Yeah, so one of the things that our team is going to be putting our heads together on is how can we support provide some kind of continued support and mentoring of folks if they want to use the tool subsequent to the course. And I think, Sherry, I think it's fair to say that we've got some ideas and we're doing some brainstorming, and I think that we can send out opportunities once that we develop some of these ideas. We can send out an email to everybody on the course list and solicit guinea pigs. If there are folks who are kind of excited about maybe using this, we would love to develop some collaborations, and we just have to figure out a way to do that in an efficient way. Do you have anything to add to that, Sherry?
No, that sounds good. I mean, that's exactly kind of where we are sort of figuring it out at this point. So we are interested in hearing from people their interest so we can sort of make a plan how to follow up on that.
Yeah, we've had a few people ask if facilitation or trainings will be supplied, and it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing. The supply will follow demand. So it would be really great if a lot of people were clamoring for that. It would kind of give us the impetus to justify or, make the case for finding ways to supply it.
Yeah, and thanks you guys participating for giving feedback, and we have a survey on the course which is more in depth, but somebody, Jordan, a participant, said they truly enjoyed the course. It's very in depth and they certainly will incorporate it into their work.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
that's so good to hear. And yes, let me just encourage everybody to take the survey, because the survey has some of the same questions that were on these slides. So having had some time to digest, you have an opportunity to give some of this similar feedback in the survey, and the survey also asks about folks' interest in using the tool subsequently. So please fill out the survey. We need constructive feedback, and we need to know that people are interested in carrying this forward so that we can be inspired to figure out what the most useful thing for folks in the future. So with that, that's the end for me, Sherry.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing any hands up. Any of the other mentors? Just unmute yourself right now if you have any comments or questions at this point.
Hi, this is Britt. Sorry I wasn't able to actually be on the webinar, but I just wanted to echo all the thanks for all the participants for taking part and for experimenting with us and learning with us, and we look forward to your feedback. So thank you very much.
And this is David. I also want to thank everyone and note that there's probably still, almost certainly, still a lot to learn about using the adaptation design tool, especially activity 2 and the supplementary outputs, which are much less explored in practice. So we're looking to you and your peers to push the boundaries of the tool, find new applications for it, find new systems, and hopefully, please let us know about it so that we can share the knowledge as you share it with your colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is Kim McGuire from American Samoa. I just wanted to thank everyone for this opportunity. It's been great to give this a try, and I found it to be very helpful, and I hope to use it in my future work. And it was it was a great activity to be a part of. So I wish everyone out there the best with using this tool. And thank you very much to the team who organized this.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
Congratulations and good job, everybody. Thanks, Sherry.
Great. Thanks. So I'll just wrap up. I just have a few more slides for you guys before we end today. As we were just talking about the survey, we're taking it really seriously. So we hope that you can give us detailed and thoughtful feedback. We are, this is the first time we've run the mentored course, and you'll find the survey at the bottom of the course page along with the certificate for taking the course. So once you take the survey, then it will activate the certificate and you can download that. And then I also wanted to let you know that we will be running, I want to let you know first that there's a self-study version of the course. So we're going to leave this one open for a little while longer to give you a chance to finish up, and some others. And then there's also a course that's includes the lessons that you took, and we'll have the assignments. We're going to update it, but it doesn't have the interaction with mentors. So you guys got the best version of the course at this point. But if you have someone in your team or someone like that you work with that is interested, they can take that at any time. And finally, I wanted to thank our funder, the Department of the Interior, and partners on the course, the US EPA and NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program, and all of our mentors on the team that we've had throughout the course on our webinars and forum. And we hope that you've gotten something out of the course and you've gotten a little bit of a taste of how to incorporate climate smart design into management activities, and you got introduced to a new tool. And the other course I wanted to tell you about that we're going to run, a mentored course. It's not on this topic, but it is on effective communication to reach your conservation goals and develop a strategic communication plan. We're planning to run that after the new year, I believe January. So we'll be sending out information about that course in December. And again, please reach out to us by email or on the forum. As Jordan said, we'll be monitoring the forum for a while longer with your questions and feedback. And thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you. Yahoo!
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.